Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well? Um, yes, we'll be starting right now. Um, yeah, I should first say, my name is Gosia Śmieszek-Rice. I'm a researcher here at the UIT, Arctic University of Norway, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel that we organized together with Svein Vigeland Rotem from Fridtjof Nansen Institute. Unfortunately, Svein couldn't be here for the weather events that I'm sure you experienced yourself. So Svein is passing his greetings, but unfortunately he couldn't be here in person. The second technical announcement, you can probably hear my voice. It is not perfect, so apologies for that. But that being said, welcome to this session, one of the first ones of this year's Arctic Frontiers, dedicated to the extremely important topic of Arctic scientific cooperation and Arctic science in times of crisis. And if you paid a closer attention to the title of this session, it actually has crisis in plural, because it's not only, of course, the effects of the Ukraine war and the effects that the war has had on circumpolar collaboration, but of course we are also constantly grappling with climate crisis, and this one is not going away, but for everything we know, it is just intensifying. So the questions we want to address in today's presentations of our extinguished speakers that you are going to see here very shortly on stage concern exactly how can we grapple with these two simultaneous crises. How can we address them? What are the pathways? What are the effects that we have seen so far of the pause on collaboration with Russia on Arctic science and conduct of scientific research? It is my great pleasure to moderate this discussion, and I'm very thankful to all the panelists who generously accepted our invitation to this discussion. And I will be introducing them one by one as they will be coming on stage. But it is my special pleasure to welcome to stage our first speaker of the day. I'm sure many of you know him because we are honored to have with us the laureate of Moon Prize of this year, Professor Oren Young, who I think it is fair to say that when it comes to thinking about Arctic cooperation and specifically scientific cooperation, has probably thought about these issues for longer than most of us here in the room. So with that, Oren.
Well, thanks, Gosia. I'm going to move this a little bit to the side so you're not looking through the water bottle at me. Great to be here. Great to see old friends, new friends. So I want to make two sets of comments in the next few minutes. First of all, on the impacts of what I guess I think of as the twin crises, the Ukraine war and the climate emergency. And then I'd like to make a few comments on a second topic of what I call the determinants of successful scientific collaboration. Because after all, it's a great idea to promote scientific collaboration, but that doesn't guarantee that it achieves very much in terms of making a real significant contribution to knowledge or contribution to human welfare or anything else. So those are the two topics that I'll address briefly. First on the consequences of the Ukraine war, or I'd say more broadly, the growing East-West hostility, because this is not something that's just suddenly came out of nowhere in February 2022 with the Ukraine war, but it's a longer-term kind of relationship. And obviously, the consequences of this crisis have been extremely disruptive. There's no question about the disruptiveness, and I don't want to gloss over that in any way, shape, or form. But I do want to make three comments about the effects of this crisis. One is that the effects are more severe in some areas than others. So generalizations about the effects of the crisis aren't, I think, really very helpful. So, for example, I have a colleague who is an American colleague working in linguistics, and she is continuing extensive long-term collaboration on linguistic issues in Russia. When it comes to scientific cooperation relating to the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, there's continuing collaboration. So, of course, you've all read, I'm sure, the recent articles about the problems with climate research, and those are very severe, but so more severe in some areas than in others. The second point is that workarounds become more and more important in this context. Trying to figure out clever ways to get from A to B, even when the direct route from A to B may be blocked. And people are coming up with all kinds of interesting, kind of clever and practical ways to continue to conduct science even when there are these blockages or problems. And the third point I want to make about this crisis is that the difficulties of integrating Russian science into international scientific effort are not new. I mean, my experience goes back to the 1980s, and it's always been difficult. It's never been easy. There have been ups and downs. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier, but it's always been a challenge. And so my point in this context is, yes, the disruptive consequences are severe, they're very disturbing, but we shouldn't overreact. We shouldn't overdo our conclusions about the consequences of this crisis. The consequences of the climate emergency, on the other hand, I think are very different. In some respects, I think the climate emergency is good news for Arctic, or I would say polar regions, scientific cooperation. I remember going back to the 1980s and being very much a part of the U.S. Polar Research Board. There was a real sense that scientific research on the polar regions was of intense interest to a relatively small group of specialists, but from the point of view of mainstream, cutting-edge scientific initiatives, there was a sense in which the polar regions were a little bit of a backwater. Now, in terms of the climate emergency, the polar regions, both polar regions, but certainly the Arctic, are absolutely front and center. So everybody who is anybody concerned with scientific research that's in any way related to climate change, either the causes of climate change or the impacts of climate change or adaptation to the consequences of climate change, are interested in the polar regions. And so the polar regions are now absolutely at the cutting edge and at the forefront. So from the point of view of international cooperation, the challenge with this crisis is how to take advantage of a good thing, how to integrate all these opportunities that arise. So that's the first set of points. Let me very quickly turn to the second set of comments that I wanted to make, the determinants of successful collaboration. My proposition, and happy to talk about this in the Q&A part of this, is that the results of international scientific cooperation, especially on a large scale, are quite often disappointing. Scientific cooperation sometimes produces important results, but often not. So just because we're finding ways to maintain scientific cooperation, don't get the idea that success is guaranteed. success is not guaranteed. And so, what are the determinants? What makes for really successful scientific collaboration in the polar regions and the Arctic and elsewhere? And here, what I want to suggest very quickly, and we can come back in the discussion period, is this concept of what I call the golden triangle. Really successful scientific collaboration, in my experience, going back over a few decades, occurs when you have a simultaneous positive conditions in three dimensions. One is you need to have a really exciting, appealing science plan. You have to have a science plan that people say, yes, I want to be involved in that. That's good stuff. That's something I could really enjoy over a period of time. The second is you have to have really effective leadership. And leadership in scientific cooperation is a very special kind of leadership because, as you know, guiding scientists is kind of like herding cats. So if you want to be a leader in science, you can't just say, do this, do that, and go ahead and do it. You have to be very clever. But effective leadership is the second determinant condition for success. And the third is to have a secure and sufficient funding stream. And it's amazing how often one or more of these conditions isn't present. Where you try to do scientific collaboration, but it turns out that the 3 points of the golden triangle don't actually come into focus at the same time. And so my view is that this is what we really need to focus on. I think an example that will be familiar to everybody in the room, 2019, 2020, is the Mosaic expedition, where even under adversity, after all, COVID struck during the middle of Mosaic, right? I mean, this was not the easiest collaboration to carry out, but it was highly successful. And we could all probably name other examples. And let me just close by saying that it's not just keeping scientific cooperation going, but thinking about the determinants of success, which I think should be absolutely front and center for all those who are thinking about things like the planning of ICARP 4 and the International Polar Year. So I think these kinds of concerns should be at the top of people's sort of conscious agendas as they go into these kinds of planning processes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Warren. It was expected that you will challenge us from the get-go already, so that we start thinking about higher goals when it comes to scientific cooperation. Now, we will welcome to stage Camilla Brekke, who is the director of Norwegian Polar Institute. And I'm sure many of you know NPI very, very well. But for those of you a little less familiar, NPI has quite a special role when it comes to research landscape, institutional landscape in Norway, because that's the directorate under Ministry of Climate and Environment, which actually provides professional and strategic advice to Norwegian authorities and deals with all issues related to environment management of polar regions. So we are very lucky to have with us here, Camilla, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Gosh, and thank you for inviting me. I would like to start by putting it in simple terms. So the climate crisis gives scientists a lot to think about, a lot of hard scientific questions to solve. But the Ukraine-Russian crisis hinders, at least partly, our work. So we often talk about climate crisis, but if you look at the definition of a crisis, it's something that happens abruptly, and it puts an individual or a population into immediate danger. While this climate crisis situation is, to a certain degree, self-inflicted by the humankind, so it shouldn't be a surprise to us. It's not immediate that this is happening. While the Ukraine war definitely happened unexpectedly to many of us, and we went from a calmer situation to a much more agitated situation. There were immediate sanctions and measures that had to be taken. Students, academics, institutions became at risk. And international collaboration, scientific, was stopped or hindered. So my point here is that these two crises are of very different nature, and they affect the Arctic science in a completely different ways, but they are intermingled. So I'm thinking that the research collaboration, trust, is kind of broken down between us and Russia at the moment. It does hamper our ability to collect, but also to connect research data in large regions of the Arctic. We potentially could get what we call blind spots. And I believe that this creates a severe democratic and security problem, because the politics, the decisions are all to be made on a knowledge-based level. I'm sure that Gosha will ask us for a response to this, and of course the immediate one would be that we have to dampen the conflict, we have to do this in a diplomatic ways, but I think there's also things we can do right now when it comes to technology, to use to a larger degree satellite remote sensing technology, artificial intelligence, to a larger extent in the Arctic. It's always a problem when you lack ground truth data when you use remote sensing, but I'm sure we can do quite a bit when it comes to change detection, long time series. There is still work that can be done. And I think that we also can focus more intensively on the Arctic regions that are open to us, that we are able to do the work that we want. But this requires prioritization from the other 7 Arctic states. And finally also, I believe that climate parameters should have the same status as weather data. It should always be collected. It should always be available to anyone. So I think I'll leave it to that, Gosha, but maybe just finally add that I also believe that forums like this, where we meet and discuss, like Arctic Frontiers, the International Polar Year, the Arctic Council, are extremely important. We have to keep these arenas, and then we have to invest in them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla. And speaking of investments, actually our next speaker, and it ties already to one of the determinants of successful scientific cooperation that Oren mentioned, funding. It is our pleasure to have with us Sophie Løhensmetrud from Research Council of Norway, and she will share with us the perspectives how Research Council responded to, well, long-term to climate emergency, but also, of course, to the immediate one of Ukraine crisis. Sophie? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be part of this great panel, and thank you to the organizers. My name is Sophie Løhensmetrud, and I'm an advisor at the Research Council of Norway. And just to briefly outline for those who don't know, we have one research council in Norway, and we fund and invest in research for about 11.4 billion Norwegian kroner every year. And now I thought I would just go straight to the topic, to the crises at hand. I'll start with Russia. As many of you may know, in line with Norwegian the Norwegian government's guidelines, the Research Council had to suspend all institutional and bilateral cooperation with Russia. And we have seen some of the consequences of this firsthand. And today I'll just mention two of our many thematic portfolios. Personally, I work for the climate and polar portfolio, but I'll also mention the portfolio for global development and international relations, because these are thematic priorities that have had very high collaboration with Russia throughout the decade. And we can see that there has been a decreasing trend in this, and in 2022, the number of projects with collaboration with Russia went down to 0. And my colleagues in the International Relations Department, they had worked with the Russian Ministry for Higher Education for over a year on a bilateral call on environmental aspects and sustainable resource development of the North. It was published just a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine, and then, as it happened, we had to take down the call immediately, which of course felt very dramatic to all of us. And like many of you here and the research communities, the different sectors, we also have at least the networks that we have with Russia, and the dialogue has been suspended, and of course this is a great loss. And I'd also like to mention that while we have suspended all the institutional collaboration with Russia, meaning that we do not fund any Russian partners, we still, for the projects who have received funding from the Research Council, they can choose to hire, for instance, a Russian researcher who is affiliated with a foreign institution and who has a foreign bank account. But we have seen that the projects who have opted to do this, we've seen that the Russian researchers have withdrawn more and more. So this is an unfortunate trend. And it really shows that while something is possible on paper, it doesn't really work that way always in reality. And this folds over to the second crisis at hand, which is that this is undoubtedly a huge loss in times of climate crises. And especially for us to work in the polar team at the Research Council of Norway, it's important for us to note that the next decade of climate research will be absolutely crucial, and that the way forward is increased collaboration. The International Polar Year has been mentioned here. For such a small country like Norway, with huge ambitions, we want to be one of the most foremost polar research nations in the world. We have to collaborate, and at the Research Council of Norway, that is a big part of our job. It is to facilitate and make it easier for researchers to collaborate with each other. And I think that there's, for instance, the new Nordforsk initiative on sustainable development of the Arctic is an important example of initiatives that we should do forward. And also through our researcher calls, we try to make it mandatory for researchers to have an international partner, for instance. I should also mention that we are one of the few research councils who actually funds international partners. So I think our role in this as funders is to maintain funding, make it easier for researchers to collaborate, and look forward to the next International Polar Year and try to coordinate our research priorities for global action. And just as a very last note, I also think it's important to emphasize that we do the best we can to educate and have mechanisms for the next generation of polar researchers, so they can do field work, so they can have networks, and etc. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for shedding light on this extremely important dimension of collaboration. The next person, I think, almost doesn't need to be introduced to this group, and nonetheless, Rolf Rodven is the executive secretary of one of the working groups of the Arctic Council, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. And I leave it at that and give floor to you, Rolf.
Thank you, Gosia. It's nice being introduced by saying no introduction is needed. So, but anyhow, good afternoon, everyone, and what a day. It's a special day when you wake up finding yourself isolated on an island due to weather, and you just getting here to this arena is kind of an adventure. But we made it. And why is this relevant, actually, with startups like this? Well, it brings in three different concepts, which I will touch upon. It's the isolation, climate, and the need to put some extra effort into getting together and talk. So even though Gosia said there was no introduction needed, I'll at least introduce a bit of myself and the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program, or AMAP. So as she said, I'm Rolf Rodven, the Executive Secretary of the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program. The program itself, AMAP, was established in 1991 in conditions which is not too far away from what we see today. We had these conditions then where we had, actually, it went the opposite way. It was a warming of the global security conditions and an opening towards Russia, and we need to sit together to find out how to cooperate, and environment was an important part of that. So the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy was established in 1991, and 4 of the working groups of the Arctic Council by that, and AMAP was one of them. And since 1996, we've been a part of the Arctic Council. So since then, we've been monitoring levels and trends of contaminants, as well as climate change, how it affects ecosystems, including humans, which is an integrated part of Arctic ecosystems, and also how that involves multiple stresses. We do so by giving scientific advice to policymakers through scientific assessments, summary for policymakers, including recommendations. We do feed those data into to the management system of Arctic states, but also more to large sense, more important when it comes to Arctic, into international regulatory mechanisms, because a lot of the source of those issues we see in the Arctic are internationally initiated or have an international source due to long-range transport and so on. So, but in this sense, why is the Arctic so important? Well, being an Arctic inhabitant, I would say it's important in itself. It's my home in many ways, but it's also a very important global indicator on the change that's happening. Climate warming is not a new thing. I think Eunice Newton-Foote, she's been highly under-acknowledged when it comes to her findings, but in 1856, she showed that carbon dioxide had capacity to increase heat. 1896, Svante Arrhenius brought that further, saying like this will bring forward and warming of the Arctic. And since 1991, AMAP been doing climate assessments, and our most recent assessments show that the changes happening faster in the Arctic than anywhere else. We're talking about, since 1971, an increase of temperature of 3.1 degrees. Some parts of the Arctic, the particular area between Svalbard and Novaya Zemlya, it's already increased by 6 to 8 degrees. That puts the Paris Agreement on 1.5 degrees Celsius target into perspective. We're way beyond that. The precipitation have increased by almost 10%. However, most of it is by rain and not by snow. The snow have decreased. Permafrost, the temperature in soil causing thawing on permafrost has increased by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. And maybe most significantly, since 1978, the sea ice extent have more or less halved. So that is kind of the perspective we are looking into, the conditions that kind of we're discussing security in. And also I would say those are those known unknowns, but we do have some known unknowns, what we call Arctic tipping points, processes that may have a very abrupt manner and maybe, at least in relevant timescales, are irreversible. I mentioned some of them, the sea ice melt, the Greenland ice sheet melt, but also the change of the boreal forest causing more wildfires. And some of you probably noticed this summer all the news about wildfires in Canada. And I've just seen recent data showing that in 2023, the emissions of CO2 in Canada equaled 2,400 megatons of CO2. And how much is that? Well, if you take the anthropogenic emissions from Canada from 1991 till today, you take the maximum year, 2007, and you multiply that with more than 3 times. And that's the amount of emissions from wildfires. And that's that is a consequence of the change of the ecosystems we do see. So that underlying that, the major point here is we saw what happened in Canada, but we did not see what happened on the Russian side. And the frequency on the Russian side, at least to what we know, are more or less similar. So where do we stand from AMAP now? Well, the conditions we've been working on, we do see there's been restrictions in the Arctic Council, which you all know. We see, as mentioned here, we do see national restrictions on cooperation with Russia. We see restrictions when it comes to funding of cooperations with Russia. We see institutional restrictions. Universities have their own sets of guidelines when it comes to cooperation with Russia. And we do see restrictions from publishers, but also, importantly, personal restrictions. From AMAP's side, one of our main guiding principles for the work we do is scientific integrity, which in a sense of co-authorship means leave no man behind. So if you started your work with Russians, you can't just take the paper and publish it without the Russians. That is scientific misconduct. So that's kind of sets the scene. So this may have, what we try to avoid is long-lasting effects on the networks, and also to maintain reputation, particularly when we work in close cooperation with international bodies like IPCC and so on. The lack of cooperation have caused a lack of data. What we do see now is basically essential weather data being brought forward through WMO and some data on emissions to the Air Convention and so on. As mentioned here, we lack ground truthing of remote sensing, and there's a disappearance of what we call the harmonized sampling regime. We need to make sure that we sample things in the same way to make it comparable. Particularly when it comes to permafrost, as mentioned, and wildfires, that is of importance. 60 to 70% of Russia is located on permafrost, and a lot of those settlements in the Arctic located on permafrost are located in Russia. So that means that you will lack the information on the societal implication of permafrost thaw from a large part of the Arctic. However, that is more like the general aspect to it, but it was a very nice paper published last Monday in Nature by some of our experts and some of our representatives to the Interact project. The Interact project is a network of research stations throughout the Arctic, and they describe the loss and bias of data due to exclusion of Russia. One of the take-home messages is that, in particular, respect to vegetation biomass, we do see an increased bias in net primary productivity and heterogenic respiration when you exclude the Russian stations. Why is that important? That is important because what we do not really know at the moment is how does the ecosystem change due to warming feed back into climate, and respiration and primary production are key components to that. And in particular, and I'm going to end with this, what I say is, in particular, when it comes to some factors like precipitation and vegetation biomass, the offset increase by excluding the Russian stations was of similar magnitude to a shift indicated, as the shift inflicted by almost 80 years of project climate change. That means that the bias of the data is the same if you move 80 years up the projections on climate change. That puts the modeling aspect into quite a perspective. So I hope that has brought some light from what I started with, the effects of isolation, and how climate change may also, as mentioned by Oren, be a good initiative of forcing us towards a venue like this and talk and exchange data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf, for this excellent overview. I'm very, very pleased to say that even though Svein couldn't make it and he is not here in the room, we have a great pleasure to have with us his collaborator, Serafima Andreeva, who will offer her remarks next. Serafima, she is researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, and she works on issues on science policy interface, has been focusing a lot on the Arctic Council. But what is particularly interesting, I think, for our discussions here is her expertise also related to issues when it comes to science in Russia and also and specifically climate science in Russia. So also those remarks I think will be of great value to us here. Serafima?
Thank you. While I cannot fully replace Svein, I will try my best. Firstly, bridging or continuing on what Rolf mentioned and what has been mentioned in this panel up until now is that when we look at Arctic science and especially Arctic climate science, we have to look past just the science and look at the conditions that form the science, as Oren Young mentioned, and also what are the effects. This is what I wanted to talk a little bit about today. So the question I'm interested in here is, what are the conditions, what are the drivers that have been shaping international scientific cooperation on climate in the Arctic until now? What have they been before Russia invaded Ukraine, and how have they changed? What does the landscape look like? What is the room for maneuver, essentially? And of course, there are very many ways to approach this question. I choose to focus on 3 points that may supply some of the very informative, key areas mentioned by the panelists until now. So the 3 areas I want to talk about. First thing is the value of research and networks, a little bit about the translation of knowledge and from science to policy, and also a bit about the situation in Russia and the situation in international Arctic climate science in relation to Russia. So there's been a lot of talk about data loss. When we can't access Russian science, we can't access data on permafrost. We do not know what the migrating birds are doing, what is going on with the emissions. And of course, there have been problems in relating to gathering data from Russia before. And it hasn't been problem-free in the Arctic Council, I can imagine, either, and also related to how they're measured and who measures how, or who measures what and how they measure it. However, I think one key area to take into account when we look at the lack of scientific cooperation is not only data, it's also the social aspect of it. It is the research and networks. Because as the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy or the Arctic Council were established on the basis on trying to connect this like pan-Arctic scientific community in all of these different types of organizations, and the Arctic Council being a product of this. And when there is a loss, and I know that the Arctic Council, they are trying to incorporate some sort of dialogue with Russia, but we still see that there are several challenges tied to the maintenance of the research and networks. Because the research and networks, what do they have? They have cultural capital, they have knowledge that has been created in social settings that can't really necessarily be replaced very easily because it's constructed in the relations in between scientists that have been working together for some time. And they're also being created on the basis of trust. And trust was mentioned, Camilla, you mentioned trust in this sense, and I think it's very, very important when we look at the social dimension of it. Because yes, we are losing access to Russian data, but what will this say in the long term when we look at the networks? How will they be rebuilt? I mean, can those be rebuilt? Is it any point in rebuilding them? And if yes, then how does one approach that? I think that is a very key area to think about when we think about cooperation and lack of cooperation, because it's not only data in this sense. Secondly, my point, I wanted to talk a little bit about the science policy interface, because you mentioned science policy interface. I have to mention science policy interface. I really love to talk about it, because the thing is, when we can't really, the Arctic international scientific communities have been significantly affected, of course, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and those have been affected internationally, but also internally in Russia. Their academics in Russia have been affected, and the translation of our understanding or the knowledge on climate changes has also been affected in the sense, and the use. And when I say translation of knowledge, what do I mean? I mean when you publish a report that is very, very technical, because most of the Arctic sciences are super natural sciences, etc. I'm speaking as a social scientist. Most of the terms I just, but they're very technical, right? So to make sure that the politicians understand this, you have to translate it, and it's usually the scientists that translate it. Of course, politicians and there are organizations that do it, but it's usually the scientists. So for those results to be translated, it has to be taken seriously in policy, and it has to be taken seriously actually in all of in each part of this. And my question to this is, and what I'm wondering is, how will the translation of climate knowledge in Russia look like? Because we know that in Russia there has been a focus, especially in political discourses, there are on benefits of climate change. The Russian related to Russian climate science, I mean, they have been more or less the dominating discourses have been in line with IPCC. So it's been like you do accept that there is a climate changes. However, there are more opposing voices to these perspectives, thinking that it may be cyclical, etc. But there are still voices that say the climate change is very, very real, and it is happening. So what is going to happen when the politicians mostly emphasize the benefits of climate change? How will you look at this? So especially given all of the very scary information, I didn't like that the thing that you mentioned, Rolf, and the prospects of the future of the Arctic climate. So I think it's very important to keep in mind the translation of knowledge from science to policy. And also in relation to this, when looking at Russia, I think one thing is also relevant to think about is the position of Russian scientists, because a lot of Russian science is, of course, state governed, is very hierarchical, many of you know. But I'm really curious as what is this going to look like for the scientists that are opposing the Russian regime that didn't really make it out? I don't necessarily have much data on this. If anyone has, it would be lovely to hear. But I'm very interested because, on one hand, you may be stapled as a foreign agent for just cooperating with international scientists, and I know it's kind of a lot of people are being stapled as foreign agents right now. So there could be raised a question as to how much chaos is in this term, or how much consequences will one face. But it's still a risk. So you face risks internally, and you may face risks externally as well when you can't really cooperate, or when the cooperation is frozen. That is also a thing I think to think about in this sense. And a last remark is I've been mostly looking at the Arctic Council. I'm very interested in the Arctic Council, mostly because it is the main the main forum that survived or functioned, as we now have to say, or should say. And I think it's very important to look at the Arctic Council and to look at it as an example of the things I mentioned. But still, I think it's important to keep in mind that it is still a case. It is still just a part of the total system of Arctic governance. It's still a part of the scientific the systems of international Arctic communities, scientific communities. So to look at the role of the organizations going forward in contrast to the scientific communities going forward, I think is also worth keeping in mind. Yes, I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Serafima. And last but definitely not least, we are actually inviting as the last speaker to this panel a person who I think nicely frames it with Oren beginning and Ivan Bloom, the senior fellow with the Wilson Center and previously for many years with Director of Ocean and Polar Affairs at the US State Department. To offer some reflections on this, because Ivan was also one of those persons that was present right when the Arctic Council was established. He was very much involved in these processes and also with polar affairs throughout these decades. So thank you very much, Ivan, for accepting our invitation.
Gosha, thank you very much. Indeed, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for organizing this. In terms of those who were involved in the beginning with the Arctic Council, Lars Otto is here somewhere, so I should give him the floor and let him make the speech instead of me. But any event, it's a pleasure to be with such amazing other speakers, and Oren in particular, the prize laureate. I think you're going to have to get used to people saying all sorts of nice things about you over the next several days, but you can't get away from that at this point. And so I'd like to start with basically accepting the premise of what Oren said initially, which is in order to think about the situation we have here in terms of science cooperation in the Arctic, it really is more severe in some areas than in others. It's not a blanket crisis in terms of scientific collaboration, but there are many very serious problems, many of which have already been alluded to. So in terms of the problematic side, anything that relates to Russia and dealing with either the Russian government and often with respect to Russian scientists of any stripe, is quite difficult at this point. There is a real and pressing need to work with Russia, which makes up half of the Arctic, on climate-related issues, and that is severely affected at this point. There are data sets that are not continuing. There are access to information that is really quite important. Some of you will know that we negotiated in the context of the Arctic Council a science cooperation agreement. And that agreement, the proponents of that were very much the United States and Russia. And I was the co-chair of the group that came up with that, working very closely with the Russian SAO, Ambassador Barbin. And we worked hand in glove for a couple of years because it was very much in the interests of both the U.S. and the Russian government, we thought, for our own separate and internal reasons, to promote this particular agreement. And for the U.S. in particular, the idea was we wanted to have better access to Russia and to allow American scientists to get in and out of Russia and their equipment and dealing with payments for that you need when science is done. And we had hoped that this agreement would make a contribution to that. But unfortunately, due to the current situation, even though that agreement is in force, it isn't being used at this point. One could talk a great deal about the implications for the Arctic Council, and those who are directly involved with the working groups right now probably have a better sense than I do. But my sense is that even though there has been significant effort to try to get some of the work going on the technical and science side, it's very difficult to make good progress. Again, you have some Russian acquiescence in the various processes, but in terms of the effort and the vibrancy of the work, things are quite limited at this point. But on the other side of the ledger, the Arctic Council has survived. And I think that some months ago, as the post-Russian invasion circumstances continued in terms of the diplomacy, it isn't impossible it wouldn't have been impossible for the Arctic Council to simply have collapsed, either because the Russians would walk away because they didn't like being treated this particular way, or because the A7, the other countries, didn't feel that there was enough to it. They could have established their own organization. A lot of things could have happened. And part of what did happen, however, was the Norwegian chairship leadership was able to maneuver very successfully in a way that kind of kept the Russians in the game, and so there was enough in it for all of the different 8 Arctic states to want to keep the thing going. And there are institutional benefits of this, which I think we will find in future years may be very helpful, because if the institution had kind of blown up, putting it back together again successfully might have been extremely difficult. So it's still kind of hanging in there. I also think that the energy involved in the collaboration among Arctic states and with non-Arctic states in terms of their science programs, for example, I think has been particularly active and robust. And you see it in meetings like this, in science symposia, other places, which I think, again, not having Russia involved in things is very difficult, but this other level of energy, I think, is very important. Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement is something that has successfully entered into force and it is working. It has an important science component. The science component is a somewhat basic level at this point, so the degree to which it is a major success might be debated, but it's still working, and in terms of fisheries cooperation, including bilaterally with the Russians, it hangs in there. Relationship between coast guards, for example, in the IMO, these sort of things continue. And one last example that I'll give is extended continental shelf. So many of you will know that the US made an announcement recently about the outer limits of its claim to a continental shelf north of Alaska and in other places. This was done according to the rules in the Law of the Sea Convention, but it was done on the basis of years of work with the 5 Arctic, among the 5 Arctic littoral states, so including with Russia. So even though contacts with Russia about the technical issues related to continental shelf had stopped for a while, and have stopped at this point, the benefits of the working together of these 5 countries, I think, tends to demonstrate that that aspect of governance has been relatively resilient. So there are pluses and minuses, some things more severe than others. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ivan. And I will now ask all the panelists here to join us on stage. We'll be very cozy, so I will ask maybe a group of 3 around each table, and we'll continue with the discussion. And I'll step aside. If I could, please go ahead. So yes, don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
And I would also say, well, there is a mic there. Well, we have microphone in the room. So basically, I would like to just start off this discussion with a few questions to follow up. But we have also, I think everyone recognizes that we have also such tremendous amount of expertise and experience in the room, in the audience, that I would like to soon hand out the floor to you for your questions and also comments. But before that, even I actually just for one moment, and it was because IPY, International Polar Year, was mentioned here, and your experience actually goes, it covers not only Arctic affairs, but also Antarctic Treaty System. And I'm saying this only for a reason, because IPY, it is not Arctic year, it will be Polar Year. So perhaps if you could just shed light for us briefly on how the situation with Russia has played out in the context of scientific cooperation in the Antarctic, and as hugely different these two universes are, is there perhaps anything that could inform our actions here?
Sure. Well, I think the situation is rather different, and I should make a distinction between scientific collaboration and Antarctic governance, which are not always quite the same thing. So, in terms of Antarctic governance, the Russians have continued to attend Antarctic Treaty Consultative meetings. They've continued to attend CAMELAR, which is the Southern Ocean Fisheries Organization. The level of basic cooperation between Russia and others in these and other fora and is like it is with lots of other multilateral fora, in that things don't go very easily or well. And yet, these treaty instruments basically have held so that the discussions continue to go forward. Now, in terms of direct, like for the U.S., was never having a lot of direct scientific cooperation with the Russians in Antarctica, and I'm quite sure that isn't a lot of it, post invasion in any event. And I would guess that that's true with a lot of other countries as well. But realize that there are some countries that will be cooperating with Russia, such as China or Belarus or whatever. So, any event, the governance part continues.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, this is kind of awkward. I'm just stepping there so that I don't exactly. But Camila, here or there, whichever mic is. Is it on?
Oh.
Is it?
I don't know, I can use this one.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the International Polar Year topic, since we have a representative from the Norwegian Research Council here who mentioned that there are instruments to fund international collaborators. I was just wondering if the Norwegian Research Council have been thinking about what kind of instruments we can have in connection with the International Polar Year, and then I'm thinking about polar research, of course, Arctic, Antarctic, and international collaboration.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really important question. We are, at the Research Council, part of many international initiatives. They're not that famous, I suppose, but currently Norway is chair of the Arctic Science Funders Forum, where we gather with other science funders to try to collaborate on which priorities we should have for the next years. And I think that we have to use those networks that we do have to try to what was the question specifically?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the International Polar Year, and the idea here is to collaborate internationally to really, move forward in terms of science, Arctic, Antarctic, the climate question, and we need some, funding instruments to really make this happen also nationally.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think that in addition to what I mentioned, we also, this year, actually, we're getting new portfolio boards, and they are the ones who decide on the strategy that we will move forward when it comes to what we want to invest in thematically in the Research Council. So as of now, it's really interesting times because we recognize that the Antarctica is especially important to prioritize. So it's an interesting time.
Thank you. Sorry, this setup. Rolf, following up on the questions of funding, it is actually because you covered very well the effects of, especially of the Ukraine war on the collaboration and what it means. But specifically for AMAP, that of course, has been key to producing major assessments, is how this has affected your ability to conduct work, to conduct assessments. How has it affected your funding situation, as well as networks of research collaborators? Because, I mean, one thing is, of course, many of those things we raised already soon after invasion. It was actually Arctic Frontiers in 2022, was in May, so we were sort of having these discussions really fresh. Now we are into this situation where we know it's going to last longer, and I think, some of the things we can continue for some time, find maybe workarounds, maybe Oren can speak a bit more about those, but then there is the question, of course, we cannot, or can we go on forever like that?
No.
Thank you.
Let me elaborate a bit. So first, on the funding, I didn't elaborate on the organization structure of AMAP, but I mean, it's a secretariat functions. The secretariat itself is quite small, but we rely all our assessments upon the knowledge or the scientific work and scientific efforts of about 800 experts distributed worldwide, most of them from Arctic states, but also indigenous peoples and observer states and observer organizations and people, and also experts outside of those. So it's a very, I mean, as long as you're regarded as qualified to contribute to the assessment, you are qualified. So there's no national aspect to that in that sense. However, those experts do rely upon some kind of funding, of course. However, for AMAP's case, most of the funding is in kind. So each state fund their own experts. So each contributor kind of fund their own expert in that sense. So when it comes to funding, we haven't been very affected, I would say. We still, and we deliver those assessments that we had on the table when we started. However, what I would say we see an impact is, currently is on the networks, because we do lose our networks towards Russia. When people do not meet and people do not, I mean, as Oren said very nicely, it's like herding cats. You really need a good motivation, and for the experts, the motivation is to make a difference. And if you can't sit down and discuss on how to make a difference when it comes to climate change and pollution, you will lose your motivation. So the networks will start crumbling. And we do see already that, I mean, people lose contacts with Russian colleagues, and scientific cooperation is based upon trust. And trust is based upon personal relationships. And those are crumbling at the moment. There are several reasons for doing that without me going into detail on those. The other severe impact, I would say, is when it comes to in the longer run, to be able to do, like, I mean, when we do our planning, we plan for 6-8 years ahead. And to do so, we need to know not only what are the knowledge gaps, but what are the policy relevant issues, what are the policy gaps which we need to address. Because we're not a scientific organization, we are a science to policy organization. So we need to know what are those highly relevant knowledge gaps for policy making we need to address for the next 6 to 8 years. And that is very hard to do if you can't sit together with the heads of delegates and the experts and discuss like what to address. And I would say that those two effects are the most important at the moment.
Thank you very much. And also to say, you're mostly encouraged to have a discussion among yourselves, but on the one word that was first mentioned by Camila and now you rolled, the question of trust. But I'm thinking, Oren, it's I was very young at the time, but it sounds like the start of actually circumpolar collaboration. It didn't arise at the time that was also marked by deep trust between, at that time, Soviet Union and the United States. And nonetheless, the circumpolar collaboration began, and it kept on developing over these 2 decades, imperfectly, and I think we all know it. But is there anything perhaps that we could take from the start of that collaboration when it comes to trust and pathways?
Well, there's no question that trust is a critical factor. My experience on trust is it's very much a phenomenon that develops at the level of human, personal relationships. It's really critical to get people to step out of their formal roles and to get to know each other as actual human beings. And that is often a very difficult thing to do. I remember going back to the 1980s, Soviet times, when we actually managed to bring people together who had no reason whatsoever at the outset to recognize, much less trust each other, but we managed by bringing them together not in sort of formal sessions, but after a while when you sit together and tell jokes together and share a beer and don't relate to each other in terms of your formal roles, these kinds of relationships develop. I think Rolf is exactly right that there is this danger over time of crumbling, of erosion of trust, and that's a very real danger in these times. And even those of us who have, I, for example, continue to have collaboration with several different Russian collaborators, but there's this sense of concern and kind of the feeling of needing to be very careful because we don't know exactly what the consequences are likely to be on a human scale. So interaction goes on, but there is, I think, this very real danger in terms of the more human scale, but very important interpersonal kinds of confidence.
Thank you. Well, I would like to open the floor for questions. So I think there is a mic around, and we already have questions. Perfect. There we go. I will have then one more myself, but happy to save it for later.
Hi, thank you. I'm Maria-Helena Sivonen from the Finnish Environment Institute. I was so eager to ask because it's exactly for this topic that you were already discussing. But you all represent institutions and organizations that indeed have a history already. But people change and all kinds of other changes occur in institutions and organizations. How do you preserve institutional memory? And how do you see it has affected your work or the collaboration in general? Thank you.
I have one immediate response to that. I'm not sure if it's really fully answering your question, but something I've been thinking a lot about, and that is a question of finding ways to record and capture the experiences that people have had over the years. I mean, there are a lot of us around who are not going to be on the scene indefinitely, but who have been through a lot. And I think in terms of passing some of this experience, let's not call it just knowledge, but experience, kind of on to next generations, there's a lot to be said for making sure that we pay really close attention to oral history, so that the experiences that we've had are not completely lost. I've been talking a lot about this recently with Bob Carell, who most of you will know, but who also, like me, is a person in his 80s. And we're talking a lot about what can we do to capture and to make available kind of a library, an archive, if you will, of kind of oral history, the recording with some kind of organized conversations, with kind of focused questions, what our experiences, insights, and observations have been from the various episodes and situations we've been in. So it's not a full answer to your question, but it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately, as sort of not losing the collective experience that those of us who've been engaged on a very personal level have had over the years, and trying to capture that.
I just want to follow up on Oren. It's always an honor talking after him, and just to address your question with the last topic on trust, because we have to distinguish between trust between institutions or states and trust between people. That is two completely different things. states can have mistrust each other, still people can have trust each other on the individual level. And that is very important to remember under conditions like this. And when it comes to institutionalizing that, it also kind of brings into what I think is a way forward, and I know you're a part of this, and we can go back to that in a second. That is to bring in the young researchers, the young scientists, the young policymakers, and so on, and bring them with you, because you can only build trust face to face, and to bring them with you, so it's not only under four eyes, but 6 or something that helps kind of institutionalizing that kind of trust. And that is important, because you have to remember, doing nothing is still doing something, because if you don't do anything, there is this natural turnover. People are disappearing from the institutions of natural causes and of changing jobs. So the memory will be lost, whether you like it or not, by doing nothing. To prevent that, you have to be active and do something. And that is a very important part. And if I can, I also I think the emerging leader programs where you participating, emerging Arctic leaders program is a very important part of that, to kind of bring the young people into this kind of setting, and to kind of give them the network, give them possibility to build that kind of trust themselves. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that what we have lost here is the science diplomacy. And just to remind ourselves that the relationship we had with Russia when it comes to science and institutional collaboration, it took us decades to build that up, from the early 1990s for the community here in Tromsø. And it's now torn down. I think we need time to rebuild this when the situation has changed. And I agree that the youth, the young ones, that's where we have to start. They have to learn the history, but at the same time they start with more fresh pages.
Let me just say a word about Let me just say a word about this. It follows on something Rolf said, where there's a really important distinction between what I think of as the Arctic community, that is a collection of individual human beings who over a fairly long period of time have developed interpersonal relationships, versus the more official or more formal relationships that have grown up in the context of organizations like the Arctic Council and so on. And it's true that if conditions remain adverse, the relationships among people in the Arctic community will begin to decline, begin to attenuate. But I have to say, I think that this community of individuals has an especially important role to play during times when the more formal organizational or intergovernmental relationships are broken or difficult or made or adverse in a way. So I think those of us who carry this kind of engagement on a personal level in the Arctic community have a particularly important role to play, and even an obligation to play that role in these times. Sorry, Evan.
I just reflecting on this as a former diplomat. So I spent a lot of time working with professionals in other governments, including governments where the U.S. didn't always have a terrific relationship with these others. And over time, it really was possible to develop personal relationships with the Russians or the Chinese or even Norwegians, you know. And it was, it provided the ability in the service of my own country to have this ability to reach out to others personally in ways that would achieve U.S. foreign policy objectives, but also just kind of make things work. And when things shut down, like they have with the Russians, that has made it, I think, more difficult for my former colleagues who are, you know, Russia hands and others at the State Department to have that effect, that modulating effect on developing policy. But there's also a self-correcting aspect to this, because professionals in these organizations are used to, they're at an embassy in one place and then they go to another. They meet new people, and there will be new people ready to talk with Russians and others when the time comes that that's possible. So there is this difference, between institutions and people, and you want to keep the people working together. But institutions, such as foreign ministries, are also designed to try to bring those connections back when it's possible.
I think Gosia left us, and I think I asked Serafima if she would like to take over.
Yeah, I can moderate. Any questions? I saw that hand in the back first, and you had the microphone.
Scott Polar Research Institute, University of Tromsø. We've actually been here before. With the death of Stalin, there were two glaciologists that came to Cambridge and organised a visit for two Cambridge scientists to go to the Soviet Union. And it's really affirming what Oren has said, is that those personal connections are incredibly important. And then the second thing is that having an international polar year so that the structure of the nation gets engaged, allowing those scientists to be part of that is a fundamental step going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, there are more questions.
More questions? Yeah, okay. Yes. Yeah, Klaus, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Henry Burgess from the UK, from the Arctic Office, and also from IASC, International Arctic Science Committee. We've been very heavily involved in planning the International Polar Year with colleagues in Antarctica and the UN and the International Science Council and others. And I wanted to ask you whether you think, having heard you talk about the International Polar Year just now, at this planning stage now, we should be loading onto the shoulders of the IPY a responsibility for recreating science diplomacy and partnership and trust and engagement. We should make that at this stage an explicit ask of or expectation of the IPY, or we should be saying the IPY should be focused on science cooperation and partnership and answering big research questions and let the trust and the cooperation flow as a result of that focus. Is that a dichotomy you recognise, and do you have advice on how we should pitch that?
Should I have one question more, or do you want to answer?
Maybe I can just come. No, I think that's a really great idea to kind of relaunch or put a focus on the science diplomacy and trust. And I think we should already now start thinking about how would Russia come into the International Polar Year, or would they?
So, if I may, Henry, you touched on something that is particularly interesting, and I'll give you an answer that I wouldn't have given in government. The answer from a think tank point of view is, at least from a U.S. domestic political point of view, it's actually quite sensitive to announce, okay, now we're going to get into this big project which is going to involve direct contact with Russians and possibly Russian science institutions. So from my point of view, in Washington, maybe London is a similar sort of circumstance, you have to be a little bit careful with how you spin that out, because there may be some on the political spectrum who will say that it's not wise, given the Ukraine situation, to be approaching this, even if there's an overall value that would need to be explained.
Let me also just make a quick response to Henry's question. I remember in the last IPY, kind of toward the end, there grew up a kind of big emphasis on knowledge to action. But it kind of came at the end stage of the process. My view in response to what you were saying, Henry, is it ought to come at the beginning stage, because there ought to be a relationship between analysts and practitioners, scientists and policymakers and so on, not only once the science is done and what's going to be done with it, but also in terms of framing the agenda and framing the issues, of thinking, not that the policy question should necessarily dictate, but thinking together about what are the most important questions and what are the most important questions that are likely to be scientifically tractable during this time frame. So it should be a kind of an end-to-end relationship. And so I would say, in response to the question, start thinking about this now.
Please go ahead. I'm happy to say that discussion is going even without the moderator, so please help yourself with it.
Yeah, thank you very much, and get well soon, Gosha. Yeah, thank you very much. Michael Karcher from the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research. I'm also the coordinator of a large EU project called Arctic Passion, which is dealing with trying to enhance and improve the Arctic observing system, which we currently do for just half of the Arctic. Reflecting back to what you all have said, I think these were fantastic and very wise and elaborate analysis of the situation. Only in the recent few conversations, I heard more concrete words on how could we go on, because this has been for me the elephant in the room. What should we do given the situation? What should we advocate for as scientists in this ethical dilemma we are in? We don't want to go on with business as usual given the situation and Russia's war against Ukraine and how they behave and so on. On the other hand, valuing all the personal relationships in quotation marks, in brackets, without endangering our colleagues and friends over there. So given the preparations for the IPY, for example, what I would find really interesting is discussion circles on meetings like this one, where we are actually discussing, controversially maybe, what are possible ways forward? How do we act without acting as if nothing had happened, but at the same time try to rebuild personal relationships under the given circumstances? So I would just like to hear from your point of view, do you see something like that being useful? Because as scientists, as natural scientists in particular, I might say, we're hoping for some help and support from people who are versed in the policy domain, how to deal with this without destroying more than gaining. Yeah, I stop here and thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I mean, we are all dependent of each other on this globe, so we cannot not talk about, we have to talk about this, right? And luckily, the International Polar Year is still, 8-something years ahead of us, or yeah, approximately. So there might be, improvement in the future.
Thank you, and thank you, Michael, for a really nice question and for forcing us to discuss the practical sides of this. So for reminding us about that. And I think two of the tools here have been mentioned that we can use, and Evan mentioned the Arctic Science Agreement, which kind of gives us the platform to formally cooperate. It's there, it's in act, it's in force, but it's not really been used. So the opportunity is there. However, as I mentioned, what we do see is restrictions on several levels, and for me, the Arctic Council the guidelines from the Arctic Council have just been one of them. But we do see national restrictions and institutional restrictions and so on, which is where I think the international polar year comes into its effect. Because what you need to do then is we need to align ourselves on how to approach this. And the international polar year is kind of forcing us to sit together in the same room and initiate the discussion. So I think that would be, those two mechanisms would be a very important thing to work with, this Arctic Science Agreement and the International Polar Year, to first give us the opportunity and then to kind of force us to actually do something. Because as Camilla said, there's need to do something. Thanks.
Yeah, I can also comment a little bit on that. That is the great question, isn't it? What do we do now? Can we do something? I think one thing that is important to keep in mind in this sense, especially looking at the Arctic Council as a great example, is the necessity of the non-legally binding, the soft law, all of the functions of international scientific cooperation that value scientific work and can, to some degree, prioritize or give some attention to the role of scientific integrity in this sense. And I know that Arctic science is not free from policy at all. It can't be completely depoliticized, but I think that one way forward to address that question is to have that lens of looking at what functions does the scientific work have and how can we strengthen it, how can we further elaborate on it, and then the question is what do we do with it when it's dependent on policy and everything is so intertwined? I think it's just emphasize the different functions of the different parts of society. I mean, politics but still having all of these restrictions. I mean, of course, one can't really continue with the business as usual when one Arctic state has violated international law. You can't really look away from that, of course, and you shouldn't. But I think emphasizing science and emphasizing the scientific integrity in this sense, in reference to what you also had in your presentation.
Anne, and perhaps the last question will be to you before we close.
Sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It's just a comment, actually. One of my hats is being the Vice President of International Science Council, and I have to say that the Russian Academy of Science is still a member. It's not expelled, it's not paused, it's still there. And the idea from International Science Council to keep Russian Academy of Science within the membership is to have this open door to collaboration when that is possible, but also to relate person to person in between. So when it comes to the International Polar Year, I think still there is an opportunity, very step by step, to engage with the Russian Academy of Science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think with this, we are coming to the closure of this discussion. Thank you all very much. I surely missed at least one point that you discussed when I was not in the room. So I'm sorry, but of course, the point is also not really to sum up these discussions in any way. Perhaps actually the hope with this discussion is that maybe we take it more as a starting point for a really thorough reflection. How do we take things from here? I mean, the need to do it is of course very clear for everyone. I just thought I wanted to mention here a few things that were mentioned in different interventions, and I guess one of them is actually what you began with, Rolf, is when you said there is isolation climate, but your third point when you were actually crossing the bridge from Kvaloja, walking here to make it to this session, you said that what is really clear that we need in the Arctic and polar research is this extra effort to make it to the table, to make it so that we can have these discussions. Yes, and sometimes it is hard, but it is definitely upon us to do it. Another aspect that I thought was very, very interesting to follow up is, Oren, you mentioned oral history. But I think this question of how do we learn from history, from experience, but then how do we match it together with fresh perspectives, with the enthusiasm, with this freshness that youth can bring, that early career scientists can bring to the table, that perhaps we already might be missing at points. The expression of community of individuals was mentioned here, that maybe as institutions we cannot necessarily work now in the way we would like to do, but there is obligation on us as individuals to do the best we can in this moment. And the last thing I wanted to say, it is actually invitation and encouragement for everyone, because IPOI was mentioned several times, but the process that is actually already now going on, it is ICARP 4, and I'm seeing thumbs up from Jennifer Spence here, and for the right reason. So ICARP, so International Conference on Arctic Research Planning, its 4th edition. The first one was started by Oren. It is going now until 2026, and under ICARB, there are research priority teams, but the one that I would like to particularly mention here is Research Priority Team 4, because this one is on scientific cooperation and diplomacy. And this research priority team over next year will be tasked with developing questions and the research priorities, specifically when it comes to these two areas. I pointed out at Jen, and I should mention also here Tom Barry, that many of you know from CAF, now from University of Akureyri. 3 of us serve as co-chairs of this group, and we would very much like to encourage everyone to contact us, and I hope this dialogue can continue. With that, please thank together with me our panelists, and also Svein, who put it together. At least I didn't.